At precisely 10:17 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday morning, Elijah Morgan carefully set aside his mop, paused for a moment to take a deep breath, and then walked uninvited into the heart of Sterling Corp's executive boardroom. The room filled with the city's most powerful figures erupted into laughter as they spotted him, a frail, elderly black janitor. Their amused glances and snickers rang through the air as they couldn't fathom what this man could possibly want in a place so far removed from his world. "Well, look who we have here," Ryan Matthews sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Lost your way, old man?" The laughter spread through the room like wildfire, as if this elderly janitor were nothing more than a mere joke. But Elijah remained unfazed. His steps were deliberate as he approached the conference table, his eyes calmly surveying the arrogant faces before him. He placed a folder, thick with official documents, on the polished table, its weight a silent challenge to the room. The laughter faltered. Confusion began to spread among the executives. "Not at all," Elijah replied coolly, looking directly at Ryan, who had yet to stop smirking. "I'm here to deliver something important." The room fell silent. Elijah's calm, steady voice pierced the tension like a needle through cloth. They had mocked him for decades, dismissing him as nothing more than an invisible janitor. They had underestimated him. Now they would learn the hard way that the man they'd humiliated for so long was not just a janitor. Elijah Morgan was the majority shareholder of Sterling Corp. He'd watched from the shadows, documented their every misstep, and now it was time for him to take back what was rightfully his. The company's future was about to change, and it would start with the very people who had belittled him. As Elijah stood there, poised and resolute, the reality began to sink in. The invisible man they had ignored for so long was about to reclaim control, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The sun had barely risen when Elijah Morgan arrived at Sterling Enterprises, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. He had been doing this for decades, starting before the office lights flickered on and staying long after they dimmed. But today felt different. Today he wasn't the invisible janitor. Today he would step into the lion's den. He pushed his cleaning cart past the polished floors and shiny glass panels, ignoring the untouched desks and pristine walls. It was always like this in the morning. The place quiet, untouched, full of potential. No one would know that he had spent years in the shadows, observing, learning, and quietly documenting everything. He knew the building like the back of his hand, every corner, every hallway, every room. He knew the faces of the people who worked here, though they hardly knew him. As he passed by the executive wing, Elijah's eyes lingered on the brass nameplates. One of them caught his attention: Ryan Sterling, CEO. He felt a flicker of recognition, a momentary connection to the man whose name was engraved on the office door. A man who had grown up in luxury and privilege, never once sparing a thought for the hard-working men and women like Elijah. Men like Thomas Sterling, his late mentor, who had once treated him with kindness, respect, and understanding. Elijah's lips tightened as he thought of how Thomas's son, Ryan, had betrayed the vision his father had built. Elijah had always known that Ryan was different, not just in the way he spoke or the way he carried himself, but in his treatment of the people who actually built the company. The people who spent years keeping the place running, keeping it spotless. The people who were invisible until they were needed for something as small as cleaning up a mess or emptying a trash bin. It was early and Elijah was alone in the building, just the way he preferred it. As the minutes ticked by, the rest of the staff would slowly arrive. They'd march in with their shiny suits and polished shoes, ready to climb higher in the corporate hierarchy. But today, Elijah had a different plan. Today, the tables were about to turn. As he rounded a corner, he was met with the sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. Ryan Sterling, the CEO, tall, dressed in an expensive suit that made his presence felt without a single word. Elijah's heart beat faster, but his face remained calm. He had waited too long for this moment, and now it was here. The time for silence was over. Ryan approached him, the disdain in his voice palpable. "Lost your way, old man?" he sneered. Elijah did not flinch. He merely slid a document across the polished table in front of him, watching as the laughter died down. The room grew eerily quiet as the executives realized what they were staring at. The majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises, the man they had dismissed for years, was not just a janitor. He was the owner, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. The tables were turning, and there was no turning back. Elijah Morgan stood tall, a steady calmness in his gaze despite the mockery that filled the room. His hands, though weathered by years of hard work, now held the power to reshape the future of this company. He had been underestimated, dismissed as nothing more than a janitor, a background figure in a world of high-powered executives. But now the time had come for the truth to be revealed. As the document slid across the table, Ryan Sterling's smug expression faltered. His lips parted in disbelief, his eyes scanning the paper as if he couldn't fathom what he was reading. The murmurs of confusion grew louder, bouncing off the walls of the conference room as the realization began to sink in. Elijah wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't a background player. He was the majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises, a title that no one had ever bothered to notice, let alone respect. As the laughter from the executives had faded into stunned silence, Elijah's expression remained unchanged. He had never sought the spotlight. He had never cared for the prestige that came with the corner office or the fancy title. His fight had always been for something deeper: justice. The room was thick with tension as Elijah remained standing, his presence commanding attention in a way that nothing else could. The executives exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Ryan, his face now flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, tried to regain control. "This is absurd!" Ryan snapped, his voice trembling with frustration. "You think you can just waltz in here dressed like that and demand—" "I'm not here to demand," Elijah interrupted quietly, his voice firm but calm. "I'm here to claim what's rightfully mine." The tension in the room heightened as Elijah's words lingered in the air. For the first time in decades, he was being seen not as a janitor, not as an invisible worker, but as an owner, as the rightful leader of Sterling Enterprises. Ryan stood frozen, a mixture of fury and disbelief battling for dominance on his face. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Elijah's measured breaths. "I've been watching this company for years, from the ground up," Elijah continued, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen your decisions, your lies, your manipulations. I've heard your conversations when you thought no one was listening. I've been invisible to you, but I wasn't blind." One by one, the executives in the room began to look away, as if avoiding Elijah's piercing gaze could absolve them of the complicity they had shown in allowing the corruption to thrive. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and the man they had mocked for so long was now holding the power they had arrogantly assumed would always remain in their hands. Ryan Sterling's face reddened with a mix of fury and humiliation as he tried to regain his composure. The room was dead silent, the weight of Elijah's words still hanging in the air. Ryan's usual arrogance was gone, replaced by uncertainty. For the first time, he was truly on the defensive. "Don't you dare think you can just waltz in here and take control of my company!" Ryan spat, his voice strained with the effort to sound confident. "You're nothing but a janitor, a hired hand." Elijah didn't flinch. He had heard those words for years. They meant nothing to him now. He had endured countless slights, countless insults, but he had kept his dignity intact. He wasn't there to fight for validation. He was there to claim his place in a company that he had helped build from the shadows. "You're wrong, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said calmly. "I'm not a janitor. I'm an owner and I've been one for decades. You've underestimated me, and you've underestimated the power of patience. The shock in the room was palpable. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, their once confident demeanor now slipping as they realized they had been played for fools. The janitor they had all mocked, the man they had assumed was beneath them, had been quietly waiting, watching, and documenting every single one of their moves. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He was fighting for control over something he thought was already his, but Elijah wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to beg for a seat at the table. He had built his seat long ago, brick by brick, in the shadows of the company, and now it was time to claim it. I've been quiet for long enough, Elijah continued, his voice steady. But now the time has come for change. This company, your empire, is built on lies, and I'm here to restore the integrity that was lost. Elijah's eyes never left Ryan's as he pulled out the official papers, the share certificates, the documents that proved what Ryan had been too arrogant to even consider: that he was not the sole architect of this company's success. Elijah was its true founder, and he was taking back control. For a moment, Ryan seemed to shrink under the weight of Elijah's unwavering presence. His power, which he had wielded so carelessly, was slipping away, quickly, irrevocably. "I'll give you a choice," Elijah said quietly. "You can either leave now, gracefully, or you can be escorted out, and you can fight me every step of the way. But I promise you, either way, I will take back what is mine." The room was still, the executives frozen in place. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all waiting to see what Ryan would do. Ryan Sterling's posture stiffened, his usual bravado cracking under the pressure, his face twisted in a mixture of anger, disbelief, and shame. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was the moment where everything he had worked for was slipping away, right in front of him. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me?" Ryan's voice was a low growl, the words escaping through clenched teeth. "You, a janitor, telling me what's mine?" Elijah's gaze never wavered. He stood there with quiet authority, the same man who had scrubbed the floors for years, who had been treated as invisible, as nothing. And yet here he was, the majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises, the true power behind the company. "This company was never yours, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his tone calm yet resolute. "It was built on hard work, on sacrifices that you and your father never had to make. But it was also built on respect, a value you seem to have forgotten." Ryan's hand slammed onto the table, the sharp noise echoing in the now silent room. The executives were all looking at him, but there was no longer any respect in their eyes. There was fear. They could feel the shift in power, the air thick with the realization that their world was about to change. "You're delusional," Ryan spat. "You can't just waltz in here with some papers and take control. My father built this company. I've worked my whole life for this." "You may have worked your whole life for it, but it was never truly yours," Elijah replied, his voice unwavering. "Your father built this company with integrity, with vision. You, on the other hand, have dismantled it for personal gain. You've allowed corruption and greed to seep into its very foundations." Ryan's face paled as the truth hit him, hard and fast. His attempts to regain control now seemed futile. Elijah wasn't just taking over the company, he was restoring it. And with every word, every statement of undeniable fact, Ryan's grip on Sterling Enterprises was slipping further away. The other executives, once silent and passive, now exchanged uncertain glances. Some seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, just how much they had overlooked. The janitor they had treated as invisible, as less than human, had been watching them all along, and now it was too late for them to turn back. Elijah stood silently, his presence commanding the room as he placed the share certificates on the table. The document that proved everything. The document that made it clear Sterling Enterprises was his, and now he would take it back from the clutches of those who had corrupted it. Ryan's face twisted in frustration and humiliation. "This isn't over," he spat, the final vestiges of his power crumbling before him. "It is," Elijah said simply, his voice unwavering. "It's over. For you." And with that, Elijah turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the stunned faces of executives who had once looked down on him, who had once thought him nothing more than a janitor. Outside the room, the employees gathered in hushed whispers. They had witnessed the transformation of Elijah Morgan, the man who had been invisible to them all for so long. They had seen him rise up, not in anger but with quiet dignity, and reclaim what was rightfully his. The day was far from over, but it had already become clear. This was the beginning of a new era for Sterling Enterprises, one where integrity would lead and the greedy and corrupt would no longer hold power. As Elijah made his way through the corridors of Sterling Enterprises, the weight of his victory settled within him. The echoes of the conference room's heated exchange still reverberated in his mind, but his resolve only grew stronger. His plan was working. He had known, for so long, that the time would come to step into the light and reclaim the company that was always his, but now he could feel the shift, a new beginning not just for Sterling Enterprises, but for every employee who had been ignored, underestimated, and mistreated for far too long. He walked with purpose, his mind focused on the next steps, but his eyes occasionally caught the glances of employees he had worked beside for decades. They watched him, and some even dared to smile as if seeing him for the first time. He had been a janitor to them all this time, an invisible man who had quietly observed, cleaned, and listened. But today they were seeing him as the leader he was always meant to be. Elijah stopped by the elevator and pressed the button to the top floor. He was on his way to meet with the department heads, to discuss the restructuring, the audits, and the new direction for the company. As the doors slid open and he stepped inside, he couldn't help but think of the years of service he had given to this place. He had wiped away the dust and mopped the floors, all the while hearing things that others did not. He had seen through the facades, the glistening surface of wealth, power, and control, and understood the rot that lay beneath. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, Elijah stepped out and walked with a sense of purpose. The sleek glass walls and polished surfaces were nothing more than a reminder of the culture he had vowed to change. He had heard the whispers in these halls, whispers about layoffs, about trimming the workforce to maximize profits, about sacrificing people for the sake of an ever-growing bottom line. Those days were over. Inside the boardroom, the department heads waited for him. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to guarded skepticism. The room was tense, but it wasn't out of fear. It was because they were about to witness a transformation that they had been too blind to see for so long. They had been living in the old world, the world where people like Ryan Sterling held the power. But today that world was crumbling. "Good morning, everyone," Elijah said, his voice calm but commanding. He stood at the head of the table, looking around at the group. "I'm sure you've all heard the news, but let me be clear. This company is no longer about maintaining the status quo. It's no longer about feeding the egos of a few powerful individuals, while the rest of you are left to pick up the pieces. This company is about integrity, innovation, and most importantly, people." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't out of fear, it was out of respect. "We will no longer be cutting jobs to boost profits," Elijah continued. "We will no longer be silencing ideas because they come from the wrong place in the hierarchy. We will invest in our people, and we will rebuild this company from the ground up. The layoffs are canceled, and the resources that were once wasted on greed and excess will be redirected to where they belong, into the hands of the employees who truly drive this company forward." As he spoke, the tension in the room began to ease. Some of the executives exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. But Elijah could see the subtle shift in their demeanor. The old guard, the ones who had aligned themselves with Ryan's methods, were beginning to understand the weight of what was happening. The power was no longer in their hands. "I will be conducting a full audit of the company's finances," Elijah said, his gaze steady. "I expect full transparency, and I will not tolerate any further corruption. As for the future, we will focus on innovation, on rebuilding what was learned, and on creating a company that values its people over profits." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. They were not fully on board yet, but they were listening. Elijah knew it was going to take time to turn this ship around, but for the first time in years, he felt the weight of the company's potential on his shoulders, and he was ready to carry it. "I'm here to restore what was broken," he said quietly, "and I will not stop until Sterling Enterprises is the company it was always meant to be." Elijah's words hung in the air as the department heads absorbed the weight of his promise. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer oppressive. For the first time in years, the executives were hearing the truth about their company, the truth about the values it had abandoned, and the truth about the man who had been overlooked for far too long. One by one, the executives began to speak. Some hesitated at first, but eventually the ones who had once been loyal to Ryan Sterling started to nod in agreement. Martha Donovan, the head of human resources, was the first to speak up. "You're right," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a new sense of determination. "I've been here for years and I've seen what's been happening. We've lost sight of what made this company great. It's time to get back on track." Elijah nodded in approval, knowing that her words meant more than just an agreement. It meant she was ready to change. "Exactly," Elijah replied. "We need to bring back the culture of innovation that was the foundation of Sterling Enterprises. It's not just about profits, it's about creating something meaningful, something that contributes to the greater good." He turned to the rest of the room, making eye contact with each person. "And that starts with all of you. I'm not going to do this alone. We're in this together. If we want this company to succeed, we need to start treating everyone with the respect they deserve, from the maintenance staff to the top executives. No more hierarchy. No more ignoring ideas just because they come from the wrong department. We all have a part to play." There was a visible shift in the room as executives looked at each other with newfound respect. Elijah's vision was beginning to take root, but the road ahead would not be easy. He knew there would be resistance. Ryan Sterling's supporters were still lingering, and they would not go down without a fight. But Elijah was prepared for that. He had spent years watching, learning, and waiting for this moment. And now that it had come, he would not back down. The meeting continued with discussions about the immediate changes Elijah wanted to implement. Canceling the planned layoffs, redirecting resources to revitalize the company's R&D division, and investing in employee development. There was some resistance, but nothing Elijah couldn't handle. He was used to fighting for what was right, and this time, he was fighting for an entire company's future. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah felt the weight of the day's decisions settle on his shoulders. But he also felt a sense of hope, a hope that had been absent for far too long. The company was changing, and with it the lives of every employee who had been stuck in the shadow of corporate greed and mismanagement. Elijah made his way through the sleek hallways of the corporate headquarters, a quiet determination in his step. He had just completed a crucial meeting with the department heads, and though the fight for the company's soul was far from over, he had seen enough signs of change to believe that his vision could take root. As he passed by his former colleagues, maintenance staff who had once greeted him as just a janitor, he received nods of acknowledgement. Some of them smiled at him, but it wasn't just the simple camaraderie of old times. There was a new sense of respect, a recognition of the man who had risen from the shadows. His quiet leadership was beginning to inspire those who had once doubted him. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt seen. The phone call he had been waiting for came just as he entered his office. Martha Donovan was on the line, her voice calm but urgent. "We've made a breakthrough," she said. "We've got confirmation on the financial misconduct. The audit results are in, and there's enough evidence now to take action." Elijah nodded to himself. He knew the battle was far from won. Ryan Sterling was still out there trying to rally his allies, and Elijah's rise had made him an enemy to the disgraced former CEO. But this was the turning point, the moment when the company could finally shed the rot that had festered under Ryan's rule. "Good," Elijah said firmly. "Let's take this to the board. It's time we cleaned up this mess once and for all. Ryan and his cronies have been stealing from the people who built this company. The truth is finally coming to light, and they won't be able to hide anymore." Martha's voice was tinged with determination as well. "We'll get everything to the legal team, but we'll need support from the majority of the board to make sure this goes through. We'll have to be careful. Ryan still has some power, but we've got the evidence now." Elijah's expression hardened. "I've been patient long enough. They've been underestimating me for years. They think I'm just the janitor. Well, they've got another thing coming." The meeting with the board was scheduled for the following day. Elijah knew it would be a crucial moment, but he was ready. He had spent decades learning the ins and outs of the company, watching from the ground level. He had been invisible to those in power, but now, with the weight of the truth in his hands, Elijah would no longer be overlooked. As he prepared for the board meeting, he couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the days when he had first started working at Sterling Corp., when he had been just a young janitor, hopeful but dismissed. He remembered the conversations with Thomas Sterling, the founder of the company, who had treated him as an equal, giving him the opportunity to invest in the company when no one else would. And now, that same opportunity had come full circle. It was Elijah's time to reclaim what was rightfully his, and to ensure that Sterling Corp would return to its roots, to a company built on integrity, innovation, and respect for all. The next day, the boardroom was filled with tension. Elijah stood at the head of the table, his suit neat and impeccable, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. He looked around at the faces gathered there, some familiar, others unfamiliar, but all with one thing in common. They had all played a part in the corporate culture that had nearly ruined this company. Martha Donovan and Jake Wilson sat at his side, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and concern. This meeting was going to be a defining moment for the future of Sterling Corp. As the last few board members filed in, the room grew silent. Elijah could feel the weight of their stares, some with skepticism, others with curiosity, but all of them knew the stakes. The evidence was in front of them, and the decisions that were about to be made would shape the company's future. Ryan Sterling's absence was palpable. It was clear he was still trying to fight from the outside, but the tide had turned. With the audit results now in hand, the tables had shifted. The company that had once been run by a man who valued greed above all else would now be led by someone who understood the true value of integrity. Elijah cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and as his voice filled the room, it was calm but commanding. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "As many of you know, we've spent the past several months conducting a thorough audit of Sterling Corp's financials. What we've uncovered is far more than just mismanagement. It's a pattern of systemic financial misconduct, manipulation, and fraud, one that's been going on for years, unchecked." The room was still. No one spoke, but several faces paled as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Elijah continued. "Ryan Sterling's actions have not only harmed this company, but they've hurt the employees who have poured their hearts and souls into Sterling Corp." He's stolen from the people who have built this company from the ground up, from the janitors to the executives. He's taken more than his fair share while neglecting the workers who are the backbone of this organization. A murmur rippled through the board, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others avoiding Elijah's gaze. But Elijah wasn't looking for sympathy. He was there to lay down the truth, to take back what was his, and to restore the legacy that had been tarnished by greed and selfishness. "I have been silent for long enough," Elijah said, his voice steady, filled with resolve. "But no more. The time for change is now. Sterling Corp was built on a vision of fairness, respect, and hard work. It's time we return to those principles." He opened the folder in front of him and placed several documents on the table. "Here is the evidence. The financial misdeeds are undeniable. The time for secrecy is over. We must act now, before it's too late." The room was now a battlefield of looks, whispers, and barely contained panic. The once mighty Ryan Sterling was now on the back foot, and the power had shifted. Elijah was in control, and he wasn't about to let this moment slip away. "I move," Elijah said, "that we immediately suspend Ryan Sterling as CEO of Sterling Corp, pending a full investigation, and that all further decisions regarding the future of the company be put on hold until we can restore the integrity of this organization." Martha Donovan was the first to speak up. "I second that motion." The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Elijah knew the fight wasn't over yet. There were still those who would try to fight back, still those who would cling to the old ways, but Elijah had the truth on his side, and he was determined to see it through. The room was a mixture of uncertainty and apprehension as Elijah's motion was seconded by Martha. There were still murmurs and quiet whispers as the weight of Elijah's words settled in. But Elijah remained resolute, his gaze unwavering as he scanned the room. His voice, calm but fierce, cut through the tension. "The company belongs to the employees, to the people who have put in the hard work year after year. It's time we recognize the worth of every individual, from the janitor to the board member, and restore what has been lost under Ryan's leadership. No more layoffs, no more sacrificing the people who have been the foundation of this company." A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the truth hung heavy in the air. No one could deny it anymore. Elijah placed the documents in front of them, evidence that could no longer be ignored. Ryan's actions had been exposed, and the proof was undeniable. The board members who had once turned a blind eye to the truth now found themselves forced to confront it head-on. Elijah wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was the majority shareholder. He was their boss now, and his resolve was stronger than any boardroom politics they had ever encountered. "Gentlemen and ladies," Elijah continued, his voice gaining strength, "this company is mine, as it has always been. It's time for us to fix what's broken, rebuild from the ground up, and honor the legacy that was almost lost. Thomas Sterling believed in me when no one else would, and I owe it to him, and to all of you, to ensure that Sterling Corp's best days are ahead of us." The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. Martha, Jake, and the other allies of Elijah's cause nodded in silent agreement. But others in the room still hesitated. One of the board members, Richard Evans, spoke up, his voice tinged with skepticism. "But how do we move forward with such a dramatic shift in leadership?" Richard asked, his gaze fixed on Elijah, a subtle challenge in his tone. "Sterling Corp isn't some small business. It's a multi-million-dollar company. You've never run anything like this before." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes locking with Richard's. "And that's exactly why we've failed. We've been run by people who believe that business is only about numbers and profit margins. But it's about people. It's about the people who work here, who pour their hearts into their jobs. It's about integrity, not just the bottom line. I may have spent years cleaning the floors, but I've been watching, listening, and learning. You'd be surprised what you can learn when no one notices you." His words hung in the air, powerful and unrelenting. The room shifted again. There were no more sarcastic laughs, no more dismissive glances. Elijah's calm, unwavering confidence had begun to break through the skepticism. Martha, who had once stood on the other side of the corporate divide, now stood firmly at Elijah's side. She knew this was their moment. Their fight wasn't just for control of a company. It was for justice, for the people who had been wronged, for the dignity that had been stripped away for far too long. "We need to make this decision today," Martha said, her voice resolute. "We need to show the employees, the investors, and the world that Sterling Corp is going to be a place that values honesty, integrity, and respect." Elijah turned back to the board, his gaze steady. "I've waited a long time for this day. We've all waited. And I can promise you one thing. This company is going to rise. We will do things the right way, not the easy way. So let's vote. Let's make this official." One by one, the board members who had once questioned him began to raise their hands in support. Even Richard Evans, the staunchest critic, slowly raised his hand. The tide had turned. The votes were in. Elijah had won. The room filled with murmurs of disbelief, of reluctant acceptance. Some faces were red with shame, others pale with surprise, but one thing was clear. The company had just experienced its greatest shift in history. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah stood tall, his heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and anticipation. He had reclaimed what was rightfully his, but the battle was far from over. Now he had a company to rebuild, lives to restore, and a vision to bring to life. And as he walked out of the boardroom, the weight of his responsibility settled in. But for the first time in years, it felt like a weight he was ready to carry. As the meeting came to a close, the atmosphere in the room remained heavy with the weight of the decisions that had just been made. Elijah's victory was not just a corporate one, it was personal. The years of silent suffering, of being overlooked and underestimated, had culminated in this one moment of triumph. But this was only the beginning. Elijah knew that reclaiming the company was just the first step. Now, the real work began. Restoring trust, rebuilding relationships, and turning the broken pieces of Sterling Corp into something stronger, more unified. Martha stayed behind after the meeting, watching Elijah as he stood by the window of the conference room, looking out over the city. The gleaming skyscrapers stood as a reminder of what was at stake. They had to be more than just a company. They had to be a symbol of integrity, of what could be achieved when people fought for what was right. "I never thought I'd see the day," Martha said softly, breaking the silence. Elijah turned to face her, a slight smile on his lips. "It's a day I've waited for, too," he replied. "But it's not over. We've got a long road ahead." Martha nodded in agreement. "And the company's future is uncertain right now. But the one thing I know for sure is that you're the right person to lead us through this." Elijah's gaze hardened. "We can't afford any more mistakes, no more letting people like Ryan take advantage of this company and its people. From now on, Sterling Corp will be about the employees. It will be about fairness, transparency, and hard work." "We've got a lot to fix, but I believe we can do it," Martha said, her voice steady with conviction. "I've seen the changes already. Employees are looking at you differently. They're starting to believe again." Elijah walked toward the door, pausing as he glanced back at the room that had been a battleground just hours earlier. "I've spent years cleaning up this building, cleaning up other people's messes," he said quietly. "But now, it's time to clean up what's been broken in this company. It's time to rebuild it with honesty and integrity." With that, he stepped out of the conference room, his heart resolute. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in his life, Elijah felt like he was finally where he belonged. As the new CEO of Sterling Corp, he would ensure that the company would honor the principles it had lost, values of respect, of equality, and of people over profits. Elijah had claimed his rightful place, and now he would make sure Sterling Corp became a company the world could respect. Days passed and the changes Elijah had promised began to take shape. The employees, once filled with doubt, started to believe in the new direction. His leadership was different. It wasn't about top-down commands or keeping the power in the hands of the elite. It was about rebuilding trust, giving employees a voice, and acknowledging their worth. At the same time, the media began to pick up on Elijah's story. The janitor turned CEO narrative took off, but Elijah never let it define him. He knew the story was about more than just his transformation. It was about justice, about reclaiming something that had been stolen from the workers who had built this company with their hands and their hearts. Martha watched as the weeks passed and saw Elijah's impact on the company. The tension in the halls had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and excitement. New initiatives were introduced, including a company-wide education program to help employees improve their skills and advance within the company. The employees, from maintenance staff to engineers, all began to see that their contributions were valued. Elijah had decided to take a more hands-on approach, personally meeting with different departments and getting to know the employees beyond their job titles. He wasn't just the CEO. He was someone who cared about the people who worked for him, and that made all the difference. It wasn't long before the results of the changes began to show. Employee satisfaction was up, productivity was higher than it had been in years, and the company's financials, though still recovering, were starting to stabilize. But Elijah knew that recovery would take time, and he was in it for the long haul. However, not everyone was thrilled about the changes. Some of the old guard, the executives who had sided with Ryan during the hostile takeover, were still resistant. They didn't trust Elijah, and they didn't like how things were changing. But Elijah wasn't going to let them derail the progress he'd worked so hard to achieve. One afternoon, as Elijah was walking through the lobby, he was approached by David Clark, the new CFO. David had been one of the first to support Elijah's leadership, but he had concerns about some of the financial restructuring that had taken place. Elijah, I think we need to talk about the financials, David said, his tone serious. Elijah stopped and faced him, nodding. What's on your mind? There's still a lot of work to be done. We've made some changes, but we're not out of the woods yet. There are some financial irregularities from the past administration that we need to address. If we're going to move forward, we need to clean up the last remnants of Ryan's mismanagement. Elijah's jaw tightened, but his resolve remained firm. I'm aware of that. We'll handle it. No one, not even the ones who thought they were untouchable, will get away with what they've done. David nodded, looking relieved. I just want to make sure we're thorough. We can't afford to let those mistakes hang over us. We won't, Elijah replied, his voice calm but filled with conviction. This company is built on integrity now, and I'm not going to let anyone jeopardize that. As David walked away, Elijah stood for a moment in the lobby, looking at the hustle and bustle around him. For the first time in years, there was a renewed sense of energy at Sterling Corp. People were talking, brainstorming, and working together like they never had before. Elijah knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to continue the fight for the company's future. With his leadership, Sterling Corp was no longer just about profit. It was about people, and that made all the difference. As the weeks went by, Elijah's leadership was tested time and time again. The pressure to succeed, to prove that his vision for Sterling Corp could actually work, weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had spent decades as a janitor, watching as decisions were made from up high, never having the chance to contribute his ideas. Now, as the CEO, he knew he couldn't afford to fail. Not just for the company, but for the people who had put their faith in him. One morning, he was reviewing the financial reports with David when Martha entered the office. Her expression was serious, her eyes filled with concern. Elijah, we need to talk, she said, taking a seat across from him. David glanced between them before excusing himself, sensing the importance of the conversation. Once the door closed behind him, Martha looked at Elijah with a mix of admiration and worry. "I just got off the phone with the board," she began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "They're starting to get nervous about the financial situation. We're making progress, but there are still major challenges ahead. Some of the old executives, those who are still loyal to Ryan, are trying to undermine everything we've built." Elijah's eyes darkened, but his voice remained calm. "What exactly are they doing?" "They're questioning the decisions you've made. They're talking to investors, spreading doubts about your ability to lead. They don't believe that the changes you're making are sustainable." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "Let them talk. Let them question me all they want. I've spent my life being overlooked and underestimated. This company doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the people who built it from the ground up." Martha nodded, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "I know that, Elijah, but the reality is the board holds a lot of influence. If they don't back you, we could lose everything." Elijah's gaze remained steady. "I didn't come this far to back down now. I've seen this company at its best and at its worst. I know what it's capable of. We've already made too many strides to let a few old voices tear us down." Martha took a deep breath, nodding in agreement. "I believe in you, Elijah. I just needed to make sure you knew what we're up against." "I do," Elijah said with a smile, the weight of the situation not completely gone, but the determination in his heart unwavering. "But I've been facing challenges like this my whole life. It's not new to me." The conversation shifted to the next steps. Elijah and Martha brainstormed strategies to solidify the company's financial future, with a focus on further increasing employee retention, restoring Sterling Corp's reputation, and addressing the lingering financial mismanagement left by Ryan's reign. But even as they spoke about the plans for recovery, Elijah knew that he had to deal with a bigger threat, one that wasn't just financial. It was the fear of failure, the fear that despite all his hard work and dedication, Sterling Corp might not recover, the fear that he wasn't meant for this position after all. But then he thought about his past, about the years spent in silence, the long nights when he had wiped down floors and emptied trash bins, watching and learning. "I'm not just a janitor anymore," he reminded himself quietly. He wasn't going to let fear control him, not now, not ever. As Elijah left his office that morning, he walked through the halls of Sterling Corp with newfound confidence. Employees looked up as he passed, some with nods of respect, others with cautious optimism. It was clear that the winds of change were sweeping through the company, and even those who had once doubted him now felt the shift in the air. His steps were purposeful. He had a plan and he was going to see it through. This was just the beginning. The following days were filled with tense meetings, strategy sessions, and relentless media coverage. Despite the pressure mounting from every corner, Elijah never wavered. He had made his decision. He was going to restore Sterling Corp to its former glory, no matter the cost. But the battle wasn't just financial. Elijah soon found himself embroiled in a war of words with the last remnants of Ryan's supporters within the company. They were vocal, determined, and more than willing to sabotage his every move. Elijah knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to fight. One day, as Elijah was finishing up a meeting with his senior executives, he received an unexpected call. It was from Jake, the young accountant who had come to his aid earlier in the battle. "Mr. Carter," Jake said, his voice urgent, "you need to hear this. I've been going through the financial records again. Something's not right." Elijah's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" "I can't explain it all on the phone, but there are several discrepancies in the records that point to something much bigger than we initially thought," Jake continued. "I think Ryan and his associates were orchestrating a much larger scheme to embezzle funds from the company." Elijah's hands clenched into fists. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only fueled his determination. "All right, Jake. Get me everything you can. I'll take it from here," Elijah said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. After ending the call, Elijah turned to Martha, who had been sitting quietly observing his every move. "They're trying to destroy us from the inside," Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. "But I won't let them. We'll expose this for what it is and we'll take back control. This company is mine and I'll fight for it just as I've fought for my dignity all these years." Martha nodded, her expression stern. "We need to move quickly. If we don't act now, they'll use this against us." Elijah stood, his eyes steely with determination. "I'm not just here to lead, I'm here to win, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that we come out on top." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Elijah and his team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, filing reports, and preparing for the inevitable showdown. They knew the board would fight back, but they were prepared. They had the truth on their side. The moment of reckoning came sooner than expected. Elijah had called for an emergency board meeting to address the ongoing financial crisis and to present the findings of the audit. As expected, Ryan's loyalists tried to derail the meeting, questioning Elijah's leadership and trying to deflect attention from the real issue. But Elijah wasn't going to let them get away with it. As he stood at the head of the table, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah began, his voice steady, "this company is at a crossroads. You can either choose to continue down a path of greed and corruption, or you can stand with me and do what's right. The evidence is clear. Ryan Sterling has stolen from this company, and he has abused the trust of its employees. It ends today." He placed the stack of evidence on the table with a thud, the sound reverberating through the room. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to believe the facts. This company belongs to the people who built it, to the people who put in the work every day. And I'll be damned if I let a few corrupt individuals tear it down." A murmur spread through the room as the executives exchanged uneasy glances. Some were still loyal to Ryan, but many were beginning to see the truth. Martha stood beside Elijah, her voice firm. "We've been watching. We've been listening. And now it's time to act." Elijah's eyes met those of the board members, his gaze unwavering. "I move that Ryan Sterling be removed from his position as CEO and that a full investigation be launched into the financial mismanagement under his leadership." The vote was swift and the outcome was inevitable. Elijah had won, Ryan was out, but as Elijah walked out of the boardroom, his heart was heavy with the knowledge that this victory was just the beginning. There was still so much to rebuild, so many people to prove wrong, but he was ready. He had spent his entire life fighting for respect, for dignity, for the chance to be seen. And now, finally, he had the power to make real change. The victory was bittersweet. While the boardroom was quiet after the vote, the air outside was electric. Employees began to hear the news, and there was a noticeable shift in the building. People who had once avoided Elijah or regarded him as nothing more than a janitor now looked at him with a newfound respect. His reputation was changing right before his eyes. But Elijah wasn't interested in celebration. He had a company to rebuild, and the work was just beginning. His first step was to address the employees directly. He called for an all-staff meeting, the first of many to come. When the day arrived, he stood before a sea of faces, some familiar and some new, but all of them eager to hear what their new leader had to say. The auditorium was filled to capacity. Elijah took a deep breath and began speaking, his voice strong and steady. "For years I've walked these halls as a janitor. For years I've cleaned the floors, fixed the leaks, and emptied the trash. But I've also been watching, listening, and learning. And what I've seen over the years, what I've heard, has made me realize something. This company, the company that your fathers and mothers built, is not just a place for profit. It's a place where we can create a legacy, a place where we all matter. He paused, looking at the crowd. A few employees exchanged glances, and Elijah could see the skepticism in their eyes. They were waiting for him to prove it. I didn't ask for this position. In fact, I fought against it for years. But I could no longer stand by and watch this company be dismantled by those who thought only of themselves. I didn't step forward for power. I stepped forward because I believe in what this company stands for. I believe in what it can become. He let that sink in before continuing. We are going to change the culture here. We will create a company where innovation is valued, where every employee, from the boardroom to the break room, has a voice, and where integrity is at the heart of every decision. This is the legacy that Thomas Sterling envisioned, and this is the legacy that we will reclaim. There was a pause as Elijah scanned the room. His words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in a long while, people were listening. Today, I announced that the layoffs that were planned under the previous regime are canceled. We will not sacrifice our employees for the sake of profit. Instead, we will invest in you. We will give you the tools, the resources, and the opportunities to succeed. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, and Elijah could feel the tension begin to ease. And, he added with a slight smile, as for the executives who thought they could get away with greed and corruption, they're gone. We'll have a fresh start with people who are committed to doing what's right. The room erupted into applause, and Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This wasn't just a battle won. It was the beginning of something greater. But not everyone was happy with his speech. Elijah could feel the eyes of Ryan's loyalists on him, watching for any opportunity to strike back. That evening, Elijah sat in his office, his thoughts swirling. Despite the victory, he knew this was far from over. Ryan and his allies would fight back with everything they had. But Elijah was ready for the battle. He had spent decades in the shadows learning how to play the game. Now it was time to lead with the same quiet strength that had carried him this far. The next morning, as Elijah made his way to the executive suite, he could feel the change in the air. The building was still, the halls quieter than usual. Employees nodded at him, and even the cleaning staff gave him a look of recognition and respect. They had all witnessed the power shift. He paused outside the door to Ryan's old office. The door was locked, but Elijah had the key. Slowly, he turned the handle and entered the room. The office was exactly as Ryan had left it. Cold, impersonal, a testament to greed and excess. Elijah stepped to the desk and sat down in the chair that once belonged to a man who had nearly destroyed everything Thomas had worked for. As he looked out the window, he made a promise to himself. This company would be built on more than just money. It would be built on trust, on respect, and on the strength of the people who had always been there even when they were overlooked. Elijah stood, his resolve hardening. It was time to show the world that the janitor had always been the owner, and he was going to do it in a way that would change the face of Sterling Corp forever. The days that followed were filled with meetings, discussions, and the undeniable tension that lingered in the halls of Sterling Corp. Elijah Morgan was the rightful owner now, but he knew that power alone wasn't enough. The true challenge lay in transforming a company plagued by years of mismanagement, greed, and corruption into a place that valued integrity above all else. Elijah wasn't about to take the easy route. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. The executives who had stood by Ryan Sterling's side were not ready to relinquish their hold on the company. But Elijah had something they didn't: the people. He started with the employees. Over the next few weeks, he held numerous town hall meetings where he listened to their concerns, their ideas, and their frustrations. For the first time in years, the workers, whether they were from the maintenance team or the marketing department, felt heard. They spoke of the toxic culture that had permeated Sterling Corp for far too long. They spoke of the missed opportunities, the brilliant ideas that had been discarded simply because they came from the wrong department or the wrong person. Elijah listened, nodded, and promised that things would change. Sterling Corp isn't just a company, he told them one day as they sat in the spacious conference room. It's a community, and we will operate like one. Your ideas matter. Your contributions matter. The change wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Employees began to feel a sense of pride again, something that had been absent for far too long. They started to look out for each other, to help one another, to take ownership of their work. The company that had once been ruled by fear and greed was now shifting into a space where collaboration, transparency, and integrity were at the forefront. But even as morale improved, Elijah knew that the real test was yet to come. The boardroom was still full of Ryan's allies, and their resentment toward him was palpable. They resented the fact that he, a man they had all dismissed, was now in charge, and they hated the fact that Elijah was bringing transparency to the company, a practice that threatened their secrecy and shady dealings. One particular morning, just as Elijah was walking into his office, he received a message from his assistant. "Mr. Morgan," the assistant said nervously, "there's a situation in the lobby. Ryan Sterling has arrived with a group of investors and they're demanding an emergency meeting." Elijah's heart sank. He knew this moment would come sooner or later. Ryan wasn't going to give up easily. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and walked toward the lobby. The group of investors stood in a tight circle, clearly unhappy. Ryan Sterling, standing at the front with his usual air of arrogance, sneered when he saw Elijah approach. "I see the janitor has decided to play CEO," Ryan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Mr. Morgan, do you actually have a plan for this company, or are we just going to rely on your cleaning expertise?" Elijah's gaze was steady. "I don't need to clean your mess anymore, Ryan," he said calmly. "But I do have a plan that doesn't involve lining your pockets with money while everyone else suffers." The investors exchanged nervous glances, but Elijah stood his ground. He wasn't intimidated by Ryan's words, and he wouldn't let the man's arrogance shake his resolve. "Your plan?" Ryan scoffed. "What exactly does that look like? Bringing this company to its knees?" "No," Elijah replied firmly. "Restoring the values that your father and I built this company on. Values like innovation, integrity, and respect for every single person who works here." Ryan opened his mouth to retort, but Elijah raised a hand, silencing him. "You've made your move, Ryan, and now I'm making mine. It's time for you to step aside." With a glance to the group of investors, Elijah knew that the battle for the soul of Sterling Corp was far from over. But the moment of truth had arrived, and Elijah wasn't going to back down. He had built this company once, alongside Thomas Sterling, and now it was time to rebuild it again. Stronger, fairer, and with a foundation rooted in justice. The war for control was heating up, but Elijah had learned something important during his years in the shadows. Sometimes the best way to lead is from the ground up. And he wasn't going anywhere. The tension in the building was palpable. Every corner of Sterling Corp seemed to hum with anticipation. Elijah Morgan, having faced the toughest battles of his life, was now preparing for the most significant challenge of all, bringing a divided company back to its former glory while confronting the remnants of the corruption that had plagued it for years. His phone buzzed early the next morning, a message from his assistant. "Mr. Morgan, the board members are waiting for you. They want to discuss the restructuring plans." Elijah ran a hand over his tired face. The night had been long, filled with strategy sessions and reviews of the company's financials. But he couldn't afford to rest just yet. The restructuring, which he had promised during his town hall meeting, was now in full motion. It was the first of many steps to restore the integrity that had been stripped from the company over the years. He walked into the conference room where the remaining board members were already seated, the atmosphere heavy with uncertainty. Some faces were familiar, others new, but all of them knew this meeting would determine the future of Sterling Corp. "Good morning," Elijah said, his voice firm but calm. "Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover." The room was quiet, save for the rustling of papers. The board members exchanged glances, their eyes filled with wariness. They didn't know what to expect, but they had heard the rumors. Elijah Morgan was no longer the janitor who cleaned the floors. He was the CEO, and he was here to make real changes. "I'll get straight to the point," Elijah continued. "Sterling Corp needs a transformation. We cannot keep operating the way we have been. We are going to reduce the number of executive bonuses, restructure departments that no longer serve our mission, and we will stop making decisions based on the whims of a few people at the top. Every single employee in this company matters, and we will operate on a foundation of transparency." A few members shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the tone Elijah had set. The idea of reducing bonuses for high-level executives, many of whom had been living in luxury while the company floundered, wasn't going to sit well with everyone. "You've made some bold promises, Mr. Morgan," said Richard Evans, the head of operations. He was one of Ryan's old allies, and his voice dripped with skepticism. "But I think we need to consider the financial impact of these changes. You're talking about cutting bonuses, reducing staff. How are we supposed to stay competitive in the market with all these cuts?" Elijah met Richard's gaze, unwavering. "You're right. This isn't going to be easy, but what's the alternative? We continue down the path of greed, of laying off hard-working employees, of sacrificing our integrity for short-term profits. Is that really the legacy we want to leave?" A few members nodded, but Richard's face remained hard. He wasn't ready to give up the cushy benefits Ryan's leadership had afforded him so easily. "I've been in this business long enough to know," Elijah said, his voice growing steadier, "that a company built on lies and deceit won't stand the test of time. Sterling Corp needs to rebuild, not just financially, but in the hearts of the people who work here. We have a responsibility to them. They trusted us." The words seemed to settle in the room. The board members looked at each other, some softening, others less convinced. Elijah knew this battle would take time, but he wasn't afraid of the fight. He had a vision for the company, one that centered around fairness, inclusivity, and integrity, and he wasn't going to back down now. "We'll start with the executive bonuses," Elijah continued, his eyes scanning the room. "We'll bring them in line with the work being done on the ground. No one at the top should make more than the people who do the hard work day in and day out. As for the restructuring, this is about building a company where everyone can thrive, not just a few." The air in the room shifted. There was a subtle change, as though the weight of Elijah's words was sinking in. He had made it clear that there was no room for complacency anymore. "And if you don't agree with these changes," Elijah asked, his gaze meeting each of the board members, "then I suggest you reconsider your place in this company. We need leaders who are ready to put the company first. We need people who understand that our success is rooted in fairness, not just profits." The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. There were murmurs of agreement, as well as some discomfort, but Elijah knew that he had started something. He had begun the process of cleansing Sterling Corp from the inside out. He had shown them that he wasn't just a janitor in a suit. He was a leader. He was their majority shareholder, their new CEO, and he would make Sterling Corp into the company it was always meant to be. The morning after the board meeting, Elijah woke up early as he always did. The world outside was still quiet, but inside his mind the gears of change were already turning. He had laid out his vision in the meeting, but now the real work began. As he dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, his janitor's uniform long behind him, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about restructuring a company. It was about reshaping an entire culture, a company that had been lost in the pursuit of wealth and personal gain. As Elijah entered the office, he passed the maintenance staff, who greeted him with nods of respect. It was a strange feeling being noticed. The janitor turned CEO wasn't just a title now. It was a reality, and it came with expectations. Elijah greeted the workers, his steps measured, his gaze steady. He walked to his office, but before he could sit down, his assistant buzzed in. "Mr. Morgan, we've just received a call from the press. They're asking for a statement about the changes you've announced." Elijah paused. The press had always been Ryan's domain, his flashy statements, his polished public image. But Elijah had never played that game. He wasn't interested in a media circus. He wanted real change. Yet this was a pivotal moment, and he knew how important it was to have control over the narrative. He picked up the phone. "Tell them I'll be in the lobby in 15 minutes, he said, his voice calm but resolute. "No more hiding. It's time they saw the real face of this company." 15 minutes later, Elijah stood in front of a crowd of reporters, the glare of cameras focused on him. He stood tall, his posture commanding attention. The flashing lights did nothing to unsettle him. If anything, they emboldened him. His story had been suppressed for too long, but now the world would hear it. "I'm here today because the company I lead is at a crossroads," Elijah began, his voice steady. "Sterling Corp is not just a business, it's a legacy, and it has lost its way. For too long, we have placed profits above people, power above integrity, but that changes today." The reporters murmured, intrigued by his words, but unsure of what they meant. Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've watched this company from the ground up. I've cleaned its floors, emptied its trash, but I've always been listening. I've always seen what the executives couldn't. Sterling Corp was built on a foundation of respect for all people, and that's what I'm going to bring back. We will no longer be driven by the greed of a few. We will be driven by the values that made us strong in the first place." The crowd shifted, the journalists scribbling down notes furiously. But Elijah wasn't finished. "It's not about me," he said, locking eyes with the camera. "It's about everyone who works here. From the janitors to the CEOs, every single person who gives their time, their sweat, their energy to this company. You deserve respect. You deserve fairness. And that's exactly what I'm bringing to this table." The words hung in the air, charged with emotion. For the first time, the company's legacy was being defined by the people who had always been invisible, the people who had been silenced. And now, Elijah was giving them a voice. As he turned to walk back inside, there was a ripple of applause from the employees gathered in the lobby. Elijah had made his stand, and though it was only a small victory, it was a crucial one. It was the beginning of the end for the old ways of Sterling Corp. Elijah knew that the battle was far from over. There would be more challenges, more people who would fight to hold on to the power they had gained through corruption. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and he would keep fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. Later that afternoon, the battle lines within Sterling Corp were being drawn clearer than ever. Elijah sat in his new office, one that felt both foreign and familiar, staring out of the window that overlooked the sprawling city. The weight of what he had just said to the press lingered in the air, but the real work still lay ahead. The call came in as he was lost in thought. "Elijah," it was Martha, his trusted ally and the head of HR. "We've got an issue. Some of the executives are pushing back. They want to know how long this new direction is going to last. Some are already making calls to competitors." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. The familiar tension from his janitorial days crept back into his chest. He'd dealt with doubt, disrespect, and underestimation before. But this was different now. He wasn't just cleaning up the mess anymore. He was in charge of cleaning up the system itself. "Martha," he said, his voice low and commanding. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but the employees are with us. That's where the power lies. We'll take it one step at a time. What's the situation in the conference room?" I've already pulled together a meeting with the department heads. The atmosphere's tense. I think they're starting to see the writing on the wall, she replied, her voice carrying the weight of the truth she knew all too well. But they still need to hear it from you, Elijah. They need to understand what we're doing here. Elijah nodded to himself, a plan forming in his mind. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Tell them to get ready for the change they've been avoiding for so long. 15 minutes later, Elijah entered the conference room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The executives shifted uneasily in their seats as he made his way to the head of the table. Some avoided his gaze. Others straightened their posture as if hoping to somehow assert their dominance in the room. But Elijah had no intention of playing the game they had been playing for years. He sat down, his gaze steady and unwavering. No longer was he the janitor. Today he was the CEO, and he had a message that couldn't be ignored. We've heard the talk, Elijah began, his voice calm but resolute. About layoffs, about restructuring, about what's best for the company. What you've all failed to recognize is that this company isn't just a building. And it's not just about the profits, it's about the people. And until you understand that, none of this matters. The room grew quiet. The tension was palpable. Some of the executives exchanged looks, but none dared to speak. Elijah continued. The layoffs? Canceled. The budget cuts? Reversed. We're putting people first, not profits. I've seen what happens when you treat employees like commodities. People who have given their all, who bleed for this company only to be discarded when the numbers dip. That's not who we are. That's not who we will be. A few of the executives looked frustrated, but Elijah wasn't finished. I don't care about the quarterly projections or the fancy bonuses. We'll rebuild this company on the foundation of respect, transparency, and integrity. If you want to stay on this journey, you'll need to earn it. This isn't about keeping the status quo. It's about earning the right to lead this company, and if you can't get behind that, then it's time for you to leave. The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time, Elijah saw the executives falter. The years of unchecked power, the arrogance, they were crumbling in front of him. But he wasn't done. I've worked here for over 3 decades, cleaning the floors, watching you all make decisions behind closed doors. I saw the good and the bad. Now it's my turn to lead, and I'm telling you right now, we won't tolerate greed and manipulation any longer. This company will thrive on fairness, merit, and respect for every single person in this building. Martha stepped forward, her face showing both relief and determination. She met Elijah's gaze, giving him a small nod of approval. The employees were already beginning to feel the shift, and it was evident in the faces of those who had been loyal. They were ready for this new chapter. Elijah looked around the room one last time, making sure every person understood the magnitude of what was happening. He was no longer invisible. He was the one leading the charge, taking back what was always rightfully his. The day after Elijah's powerful address to the board members, the ripple effects began to spread across the company. Employees, who had long been overlooked, now felt a sense of hope, something they hadn't experienced in years. Whispers of change were spreading in the hallways, and it was no longer just about the office gossip. It was about real, tangible transformation. Elijah stood at his office window, looking out at the city below, his mind racing. The weight of his responsibility settled in his chest, but there was no turning back now. He had taken control, but that control came with a price. The executives who had once mocked him would not go down easily. Ryan Sterling had already begun his counterattacks. He was not going to accept his dethroning quietly. Martha entered the office, her expression serious. "We've got a situation," she said, handing Elijah a report. "Ryan's already moving on the legal front. He's challenging the ownership documents, claiming they're invalid. He's also pushing for a shareholder revolt." Elijah took the papers, scanning them quickly. The familiar anger, the one he had kept buried for so long, flared up again. The same system that had tried to bury him was fighting back. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had the evidence, the history, and the support of the people who believed in him. "Elijah, he's not stopping," Martha continued. "He's working the media, making accusations. He's trying to create chaos." Elijah stood up from his desk, his posture straight, his gaze hardening. "I knew this was coming. Ryan thinks he can control everything, but he's about to learn something." Martha raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "He doesn't control the truth, and he doesn't control the people." Elijah's voice was calm, but there was a fire in it that couldn't be ignored. "It's time to take this head on. We're not going to play his game. We're going to do it our way." Elijah's next move was clear. He needed to act quickly, but he also needed to do it with precision. The company's financial situation was still fragile, but the people, the heart of the company, were behind him. He would show them all that Sterling Corp wasn't about one person. It was about everyone. The following day, Elijah called for an emergency meeting with the department heads. The mood in the conference room was tense, but there was also an undercurrent of optimism. The employees were beginning to understand what Elijah had meant the day before. This wasn't just about saving jobs. It was about restoring dignity and integrity to a company that had lost both under Ryan's leadership. As the department heads filed in, Elijah noticed the change. Some of them had once sneered at him when he was just the janitor, but now their expressions were guarded, uncertain. They had no idea what to expect, but they knew they couldn't ignore him anymore. "Martha, let's get this meeting started," Elijah said, his voice firm. Martha stepped to the front of the room, her eyes scanning the executives. "As most of you know, Elijah Carter is now the majority shareholder and CEO of Sterling Corp. We're here today to discuss our next steps and, more importantly, the future of the company. We are not here to appease anyone. We are here to make decisions that benefit the employees and the integrity of this company." A murmur ran through the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Elijah remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "First things first," Elijah said, standing up. "We are reversing the layoffs. Those of you who have been complicit in turning this company into a profit machine that only serves the top, your time here is over. The layoffs were never about the future of this company. They were about fattening your pockets while hurting the people who built this place." The room was silent. Elijah could see the shock on their faces, but he wasn't finished. "We will invest in our people. We will focus on sustainable growth, and we will no longer allow the kind of exploitation that has plagued this company. This is a turning point, and I'm asking you to either get on board or step aside." The tension in the room thickened, but Elijah's words rang with authority. He was not just the janitor anymore. He was the man who had rebuilt this company from the ground up, and he was ready to fight for it. After the meeting, Elijah felt the weight of what had just transpired. This wasn't the easy path, but it was the right one. The board members had seen a glimpse of his determination, and for the first time in years, some of them had actually begun to question their own complacency. This was his moment. There was no turning back and no room for hesitation. In the following days, the weight of the decisions Elijah had made began to settle in. His resolve was firm, but the battle wasn't going to be easy. Ryan Sterling had powerful allies, and he wasn't going to let go of his grip on Sterling Corp without a fight. Elijah knew that every move he made now would be scrutinized and every misstep would be used to discredit him. Martha had been invaluable helping navigate the complexities of corporate restructuring. As the days passed, however, it became clear that Ryan's efforts to regain control were escalating. Behind the scenes, he was rallying shareholders, trying to manipulate the media and attempting to undermine Elijah's leadership. It was the corporate equivalent of a war, and Ryan was using every weapon at his disposal. Yet Elijah stood unfazed. His faith in the employees who had supported him and the core values he'd always held kept him grounded. For years he had been invisible, undervalued and overlooked, but now the very people who had dismissed him were realizing their mistake. He had the truth on his side, and that was something that no amount of manipulation could erase. The tide was beginning to shift. One morning, as Elijah walked through the halls of the building that he had once cleaned with humble hands, he saw a group of employees gathered by the break room. Their faces were filled with anticipation, their voices low but filled with excitement. The energy in the office was different now. They were finally being heard. Elijah's presence in the halls, in the executive suite, was no longer a mere formality. It was a symbol of what could be, what had to be done to restore integrity to Sterling Corp. Meanwhile, the legal battle was heating up. Ryan had filed yet another motion to challenge the legitimacy of the ownership documents, claiming that they were forged. He had also initiated a smear campaign trying to convince the board, the employees, and the public that Elijah's rise to power was a fluke, a result of luck and deceit. But Elijah wasn't concerned with Ryan's lies. He had already called in a team of forensic accountants and lawyers to go over every detail. The evidence was irrefutable. As the court date approached, Elijah's confidence grew. Ryan's strategy was to drag out the process, to sow doubt and fear. But Elijah had already played his hand. He knew that the truth would win, and with each day the walls around Ryan's empire were closing in. It was the morning of the critical board meeting, where the final decision would be made. Elijah stood before the mirror in his office, adjusting his tie, staring at the reflection of a man who had come a long way. His hands, once calloused from years of mopping floors, were now steady as he prepared for this moment. He wasn't just fighting for a job. He was fighting for the dignity of every employee, for a company built on the blood, sweat, and tears of those who had always been dismissed as just the help. When Elijah walked into the boardroom that day, the executives were already seated, their expressions a mixture of disdain, doubt, and resentment. But there was something different now. Elijah's presence in that room was no longer a surprise. It was inevitable. Ryan sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with anger. He had spent the last few days preparing for this meeting, working to manipulate the narrative. He was confident, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear. He knew the tide had turned, and this was no longer his company. The truth had a way of eroding even the strongest lies. "Mr. Morgan," Ryan sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you've come to join us in our boardroom. How quaint." Elijah's eyes narrowed, but he did not react. He was calm, composed as he took his seat at the table. "We're here to discuss the future of this company," Elijah said, his voice low but strong. "But I'm not interested in more lies. You've had your time, Ryan. Now, it's time for the truth." There was a tense silence in the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. But Elijah had made his stand clear. "I am the majority shareholder. These documents are not up for discussion. Sterling Corp will thrive on transparency, accountability, and respect for every employee. Not just the ones in suits," Elijah continued. "This company will be rebuilt on the values it was founded on: honesty, hard work, and integrity. And as for the layoffs and the dismantling of departments, those plans are officially canceled." The room was filled with murmurs. The executives were shocked. Ryan, visibly rattled, tried to regain his composure. "You can't just come in here and take over everything, Carter," he hissed. "This is my company. I will not stand for this charade." Elijah's response was calm but unwavering. "You've had your chance, Ryan. Now it's time for real leadership. Leadership that values people over profit. Leadership that will restore Sterling Corp to the success it once had, and more." The silence in the room was deafening as Elijah's words echoed through the boardroom. This wasn't just about business, it was about justice. The employees who had been pushed aside, ignored, and mistreated were finally getting their due. And no amount of power, no amount of money could change that. The days that followed were both exhilarating and exhausting. Elijah's resolve never wavered, but the weight of the responsibility he now carried was immense. As Sterling Corp's new leader, he understood that this was not just about business decisions. It was about restoring the dignity of every employee who had been overlooked for so long. The courtroom battle was set to unfold. Ryan, desperate and losing his grip on the company, sought every possible legal maneuver to discredit Elijah. He called in every favor, pulling strings with powerful lawyers and influential investors, but his efforts only revealed the depth of his corruption. As the media stormed around them, reporting on the company's downfall, Elijah continued to stand firm, knowing the truth was his greatest weapon. Martha, ever loyal, worked tirelessly with the legal team to prepare for the battle ahead. She was the quiet strength behind Elijah, guiding him through the intricacies of corporate law. She had witnessed his transformation from the janitor to the rightful owner of Sterling Corp, and she was proud to be part of this monumental shift. The board meetings became even more tense, but Elijah's leadership was starting to take root. The once fractured team of executives was slowly coming together despite their initial reluctance. They saw in him something they had never seen in Ryan: integrity, wisdom, and a deep commitment to making Sterling Corp a place where everyone mattered. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in his office, he received a call from Jake. The voice on the other end was filled with urgency. "Elijah, it's happening. Ryan's trying to take us down one last time." Elijah's heart sank. Ryan had gone rogue, contacting investors and trying to rally support for his claim to the company. He was trying to turn the tide in his favor by any means necessary, but Elijah remained unshaken. "I'm ready for this, Jake. Let him make his move. We have everything in place to fight back," Elijah replied, his voice steady. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and Elijah knew that the culmination of years of hard work, humiliation, and waiting would come to a head soon. The stakes were high, not just for Sterling Corp, but for the future of the employees who had supported him from the very beginning. As the day of the court hearing arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. News outlets were buzzing with speculation, and the employees were on edge, uncertain of what the outcome would be. But in the midst of the cave, Elijah found peace in knowing that he had done the right thing, that he had taken the necessary steps to ensure that Sterling Corp would be a beacon of integrity in a world so often clouded by greed. Elijah walked into the courtroom, his suit sharp, his posture commanding. He had spent so many years cleaning the very halls that now witnessed his rise, and he was not about to let anyone tear down what he had fought for. Behind him, Martha and Jake stood ready to present the evidence that would expose Ryan's lies once and for all. The courtroom was filled with a quiet buzz as everyone took their seats. On one side, Ryan sat with his legal team, his face pale, eyes darting nervously. On the other, Elijah stood tall, his expression calm, his heart steady. This was his moment. Ryan's lawyer made their opening statement, attempting to discredit Elijah's claims and present him as an opportunist who had merely waited for the right moment to seize power. But Elijah was ready. He knew that his story, his truth, was more powerful than any lie they could spin. Elijah took the stand with a sense of calm determination. He spoke not just as the majority shareholder, but as a man who had endured years of being invisible, dismissed, and underestimated. He told his story of being Thomas Sterling's partner, of his quiet investment in the company, and how he had kept his word to remain in the background out of respect for Thomas's vision. He detailed how he had witnessed the slow destruction of Sterling Corp under Ryan's leadership, and why, finally, he could remain silent no longer. The evidence Elijah presented was irrefutable. Contracts, transfer documents, and share certificates all laid bare the truth. The courtroom fell silent as the details of Ryan's fraudulent actions were exposed. The witnesses who had come forward to testify were just the final nails in the coffin of Ryan's carefully constructed empire. Ryan's face flushed with rage and humiliation as the case against him grew stronger by the minute. His once confident demeanor crumbled, and for the first time the room saw him for what he truly was, a man desperate to hold on to power at any cost, willing to sacrifice anyone to protect his own interests. Elijah's voice echoed through the courtroom as he finished his testimony, his words clear and unwavering. This company was never just about profits. It was built on the backs of those who believed in it, those who worked tirelessly to make it a success. I'm here today to restore that belief. Sterling Corp belongs to its employees, to the people who gave their hearts and souls to it. It's time to give them the future they deserve. The decision came swiftly. The judge ruled in favor of Elijah, affirming his ownership of the company and ordering the immediate suspension of Ryan as CEO. The room erupted in applause as Elijah's victory became official, but he remained humble, knowing that this was only the beginning of the real work that lay ahead. Ryan was escorted out of the courtroom in disgrace, his reputation in ruins. His allies quickly scattered, and the empire he had tried to build on lies crumbled before his eyes. Elijah turned to face the employees who had been with him through it all. They were no longer just workers. They were a family, and together they would rebuild Sterling Corp from the ground up. The aftermath of the courtroom victory was nothing short of a storm. As news spread about the ruling in favor of Elijah, the corporate world watched in stunned silence. For decades, no one had dared to question Ryan Sterling's reign, but now it was clear his empire was crumbling piece by piece. Inside Sterling Corp, the employees were on edge, unsure of what would come next. Some were cautiously optimistic, but others who had been loyal to Ryan whispered in corners about the changes that might sweep through the company. Elijah knew he had to act fast, not just to secure the company's future, but to heal the wounds that had been inflicted over the years. Elijah sat in his office, alone for the first time in a while. The gravity of the situation was sinking in. The company was his, but the road ahead was still uncertain. He wasn't just taking over a corporation, he was reclaiming a vision that had been lost to greed and corruption. He had promised Thomas Sterling, his old partner, that he would never let this company become what Ryan had made it. Now, it was time to make good on that promise. He looked over the mountain of reports on his desk, the evidence of years of mismanagement and deceit. The layoffs that Ryan had planned would no longer happen, but there was still much to fix. He had to rebuild trust with the employees, restore their belief in the company, and ensure that Sterling Corp could once again become the innovative powerhouse it was meant to be. Martha entered the office, a stack of documents in her hands. Her face was tired, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes. "I've been going through the reports, Elijah," she said, setting the pile on his desk. "The damage is worse than we thought. We've got a lot of work to do." Elijah nodded. "I know. But we're not going to do it the way Ryan did. We're not going to cut corners or sacrifice the people who made this company great." Martha smiled, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "I knew you were the right choice. But you're going to need support. There are a lot of people in the building who are scared, uncertain. They need to know you're with them." Elijah leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "I've spent years cleaning this building, Martha. I've seen the heart of it, the people who make it run. I'm not going to abandon them now. It's time for us to build something better, together." The following day, Elijah called a meeting with the entire staff. The company's headquarters was buzzing with anticipation as employees filtered into the conference room. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, but also hope. They knew Elijah was different from Ryan. He wasn't just a businessman, he was one of them. As Elijah stood at the front of the room, the murmurs of the crowd died down. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, their expectations hanging in the air. He knew this was his moment to show them that their faith in him was not misplaced. "Thank you all for being here," Elijah began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know that many of you are still processing everything that has happened over the past few days. The truth is, Sterling Corp has been through a storm and we're not out of it yet. But I want you to know that we will come out of this stronger, more united than ever before." He paused, making eye contact with several employees who had been with the company for years. This company was built by people who believed in a vision that valued integrity, innovation, and respect for every person in this building, no matter their title. That vision hasn't changed. It's time to get back to our roots, to what made Sterling Corp a success in the first place. The crowd listened intently, hanging on every word. Elijah's words were powerful because they were not just empty promises. They were backed by years of experience, by the quiet strength he had shown as a janitor, and by the undeniable truth that he was the rightful owner of this company. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been underestimated for far too long, and now the tables were turning. "We are not going to cut jobs to pad the pockets of the executives. We're going to invest in our people," Elijah continued, his voice rising with passion. "We're going to restore our R&D division. We're going to bring back the jobs that Ryan wanted to eliminate. And we're going to make Sterling Corp a company where every person, no matter their position, has a voice." The applause that followed was thunderous. Elijah could feel the shift in the room. The employees were no longer just hopeful. They were ready to take on the challenge with him. For the first time in years, they felt seen, respected, and valued. Later that evening, Elijah and Martha sat down with the legal team to discuss the next steps. The financial audits were underway, and the evidence of Ryan's fraud was damning. But Elijah knew that this was just the beginning. Sterling Corp had a long road ahead of it, but he was determined to make it a place where justice, hard work, and integrity would always prevail. The first phase of the company's recovery plan was in full swing. Elijah had canceled the layoffs, reinstated the R&D department, and started working on initiatives to bring the company back to its roots. But the battle wasn't over. Ryan's allies within the company were still a threat, and the legal challenges were far from finished. But for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt a sense of hope. This was his time to lead, and he was going to make sure that Sterling Corp would never be the same again. The days following Elijah's decisive speech were a whirlwind of activity. Employees, once fearful and uncertain about their futures, now felt a surge of optimism. There was a newfound energy in the air. No one doubted that Sterling Corp was changing. Under Elijah's leadership, it was transforming into a company that valued every individual, regardless of their rank. Elijah worked tirelessly, meeting with department heads, reviewing financial reports, and personally checking in on employees in every corner of the building. He visited the maintenance staff in the basement, spoke with engineers in the R&D lab, and even made time to chat with the interns in the cafeteria. He knew that to restore the heart of the company, he had to understand it from every angle, from the highest offices to the deepest basements. One afternoon, as Elijah walked through the lobby, he noticed a group of employees gathered by the coffee machine. They were whispering among themselves, eyes darting toward him as he approached. It wasn't until he was nearly on top of them that one of the engineers, a young woman named Sarah, spoke up. "Mr. Carter," she said, hesitating for a moment, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. I know a lot of us were skeptical at first, but you've really shown us what leadership is supposed to look like. We're all in this together." Elijah paused, looking at Sarah and the others. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm but firm. "It's not about me. It's about all of you. You're the ones who make this company great. I'm just here to make sure you have the tools, respect, and opportunities you deserve." The shift in the company culture wasn't just about the employees. It was also about how the public viewed Sterling Corp. The media buzzed with stories about Elijah's unexpected rise to power, focusing on his journey from janitor to CEO. But for Elijah, the real story was still unfolding behind closed doors. Sterling Corp had been through a public reckoning, but now it was time to prove that the change was more than just surface level. It was about rebuilding from the inside out. A few weeks after his speech, Elijah called a meeting with the legal team to discuss the progress of the audit. The evidence of Ryan's fraudulent activities was undeniable. Misappropriated funds, offshore accounts, and falsified reports. But what truly stunned Elijah were the numbers from the employee pension fund. Ryan had siphoned millions from it over the years, leaving the employees' futures hanging by a thread. The team worked late into the night, piecing together the evidence to present to the authorities. "This is going to take some time," Martha said, reviewing the documents. "But once we have everything in place, we can start taking action." Elijah nodded. "I know, but we don't have time to waste. We need to restore faith in this company. And we need to start with the people who were harmed the most, our employees." By the end of the week, the first phase of the recovery plan was complete. The company had reestablished its financial footing, and Elijah had announced the return of the pension funds. But there was still much to be done. Ryan's loyalists were still entrenched in the upper ranks, and though the legal team had made significant progress, there were still battles to fight in the courts. Elijah's phone buzzed with an incoming message from Jake. It was a report on the company's stock performance, a 10% increase in just 1 week. "It's working," Jake texted. "The employees are starting to believe in us again." The next day, Elijah gathered the board members for an emergency meeting. The room was tense with anticipation as the executives filed in. Elijah had no time for small talk. He needed their cooperation to move forward with his vision for the company's future. "Martha, Jake," he began, looking over his team. "I know we've had our differences in the past, but now is the time for us to come together. Sterling Corp needs to rebuild its trust with the employees and the public. We need to focus on what really matters: innovation, integrity, and people." He turned to the board members, his gaze steady. "We will not be focusing on short-term profits at the expense of our values. We will not sacrifice the employees who've helped build this company. And we will not let the mistakes of the past define us." The rest of the meeting went smoothly, with the board members agreeing to support Elijah's vision. They discussed a new strategy for growth, focusing on sustainable practices and employee well-being. The company would invest in research and development, support education programs for its workers, and create a new initiative to promote diversity and inclusion. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah stood up and walked to the door, his mind already racing with the next steps. He knew that there would be obstacles ahead. There always were. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of certainty. Sterling Corp was back on track, and it was going to thrive, not just for the shareholders, but for the people who had worked tirelessly to build it. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his office, looking out over the city. The road to recovery was long, but the future of Sterling Corp was in his hands. He had been underestimated for far too long, but now there was no turning back. His vision was clear and he was ready to lead. Elijah Morgan, with newfound determination, began restructuring Sterling Corp. He knew the company was on the brink, facing not just financial ruin but also a deep moral decay. Ryan Sterling's corrupt practices had hollowed out the company, cutting corners, dismissing employees, and enriching himself at the expense of the people who had built the company. But Elijah was resolute. He began by suspending the executive bonuses, something Ryan had kept in place while employees suffered. The planned layoffs were canceled, and instead, the company would invest in its people. He pushed for an audit that would uncover every fraudulent move Ryan had made. Elijah took it upon himself to personally assure every department that they were not just workers, they were the backbone of Sterling Corp. As Elijah walked through the halls of Sterling Corp., his eyes now caught not only by the glittering walls, but by the faces of employees who now looked at him with respect. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was their leader. Employees from the maintenance team, once the forgotten heroes of the building, were now treated as equals. Elijah ensured that they received better wages, better working conditions, and even opportunities for advancement. He implemented an education assistance program for all employees, ensuring that no one would be limited by their background or their position. Word spread quickly that a new era had begun at Sterling Corp. The culture of greed and exploitation had ended. Innovation flourished as employees' voices were now heard. Elijah's quiet strength was contagious, and for the first time the company seemed to have a clear vision. One that honored its roots, its people, and its mission. But as much as things had started to improve, Elijah knew Ryan wouldn't give up so easily. The former CEO continued to plot, trying to manipulate the board and the investors. He spread lies and rumors, attempting to turn the public and clients against Elijah. But Elijah was prepared. He knew this would be the fight of his life. In the coming days, legal battles raged. Ryan's financial misconduct was revealed for all to see, and his empire began to crumble. Elijah stood firm, unwavering. He never lost his composure, never let the attacks break his resolve. The more Ryan fought, the more it became clear to everyone that Elijah had always been the rightful leader of Sterling Corp. And then the day came when Ryan's scheming caught up with him. He was arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and corporate espionage. The news spread like wildfire, and employees celebrated, not just for their jobs being secure, but for justice being served. The dust settled, and Sterling Corp began its true transformation under Elijah's leadership. With Ryan out of the picture, the company regained its footing. The stock price rose, employee satisfaction hit record highs, and innovation flowed once more. Elijah's vision had become a reality. He implemented new policies to ensure the company would never again stray from its principles of integrity and respect. Sterling Corp became a symbol of what could happen when people stood up for what was right, when they fought for justice and refused to be silenced. Elijah, once the invisible janitor, was now the proud CEO of a thriving company. A company that was no longer driven by greed, but by the belief that every person, no matter their role, had the power to make a difference. Sterling Corp, now a beacon of ethical business practices, became a model for other companies. Elijah didn't just rebuild a corporation. He built a community. He created a space where every employee, from the janitor to the CEO, was treated with respect and dignity. A place where merit mattered more than titles and where innovation came from every level of the company. And so Elijah Morgan's legacy was solidified, not as a janitor who became CEO, but as a visionary who fought for what was right, who dismantled corruption and built something better in its place. The story of Elijah Morgan was no longer just about a man who had been overlooked for years. It was about a leader who had risen, not through titles or power, but through integrity, compassion, and a commitment to justice. As he stood in his office looking out over the city skyline, Elijah felt a quiet sense of pride. He had finally claimed his rightful place, not just as the CEO, but as the true leader of Sterling Corp. The company was thriving, and so were its people. And most importantly, the justice that had long been denied was finally being served. Elijah knew that the fight was never truly over. There would always be challenges, there would always be battles. But for the first time, he felt confident that he was ready for whatever came next. He had done more than clean floors. He had cleaned up a system that was broken. And in doing so, he had built a legacy that would last for generations.